Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. I am Eric Bjornstad, your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. The Fuel Pulse Show podcast is for anyone who uses fuel or who manages fuel or has equipment that uses fuel, and that's whether at home or on the job. And so that means this podcast is pretty much for everybody. So what we're going to talk about today is an extension or a continuation of the discussion that if you were with us last time, you may remember that we were talking about microbial problems in fuel and why they happen so much more often now than in the past, and also what you can do about it, what will actually solve microbe problems versus what will not. So we talked about the fact that because of regulations, because of the removal of the sulfur, because of regulatory caps on certain elements in the fuels today, while being better for the environment, they are fundamentally different than they used to be. And one of the ways that they are fundamentally different is today's diesel fuels, for example, today's ultra-low sulfur diesel fuels have much, much less resistance to microbial growth and microbial contamination than the diesel fuels of the past. And that means in order to solve microbial problems that develop in those, you have to change your approach. We talked about the fact that in the past, 20, 30, 40 years ago, the conventional wisdom was that you could solve or prevent microbial problems by keeping the water under control, by making sure that there wasn't much water buildup and removing the water either proactively or when you realize that you had a problem. But we have found that because of the way fuels have changed, that does not work with today's ultra-low sulfur diesel fuels. You need a new approach. And we talked about the fact that the only thing that will solve or eliminate, get rid of, if you will, a microbial contamination problem in a fuel storage tank or in ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel or any other kind of fuel today is the application of a biocide, which is a chemical additive treatment that kills microbiological organisms like bacteria or yeast or molds or fungus. So you have to use a biocide to solve a microbe problem. And so we talked about how you can know if something is a biocide because we acknowledge the fact that there are lots of things out there that make claims to try and make you think that they are biocides. They kind of raise their hands and they say, yeah, me too. I'm going to solve your problem. When in fact, the only thing they may be claiming is, for example, that they control the water. And so they're relying on people still thinking about the old logic for solving these problems, which remember was remove the water or control the water and you'll get rid of the microbe problem. So we talked a little bit about how you can know if something is actually a biocide. And one of the things we talked about, one big easy way to know for sure if something is legally registered and legally approved for use as a biocide is if you find on either its front label or its back label two registration numbers, an EPA registration number and an EPA establishment number. And the bottom line there was if you can find those two numbers, it is a biocide. If you cannot find those two numbers, it is not a biocide, no matter what it claims. And if it is not a biocide and it's actually making claims that imply that it is, then it's actually breaking the law. So those were some of the things that we talked about last time. And so we want to continue that discussion. And when we left off last time, we were talking about the fact that biocides are very heavily regulated. And that's because of the nature of the thing that they are. They are chemical treatments that kill living organisms. And so you want to be careful about those. You want to make sure you have all the health and safety data that's in line. You want to make sure that you're able to show where and when and in what under what conditions it can be used and used safely and effectively. all the data to support all of those things has to be included in the original registration. And so what will happen is, if the EPA, and this is the Office or Division of Pesticides that does this within the EPA, if the Division of Pesticides approves the chemistry, then what they will do is they will approve what they call a master label. And the master label is the document, if you will, that establishes a number of things, and it establishes them as a baseline for everything else that follows. And we'll explain what we mean by that in a moment. The thing with the master label is it establishes how the biocide can be talked about, how it can be described. And that matters because one of the rules that governs creating biocide products to go out be sold out in the real world is that whatever you claim has to align with what's on the master label. Many times they'll require that it has to be the actual wording, but at any point it cannot substantively deviate from that. And so that makes biocides fundamentally different from other kinds of fuel additives, because if you have, let's say, an injector detergent package, there are plenty of those out there on the store shelves. You go into AutoZone, Carhartt, wherever, Walmart, you go on the shelves, you'll see, rows and rows of packaged, what they call aftermarket biocide products. And they, a lot of them claim very much the same things. But if you look at the way that they market themselves, they're all trying to say, I'm better than the other guy. And so they'll put marketing slogans or jargon on their labels that basically says, yeah, we're the best and they're not. And they can do that because they're not governed by the same sets of rules that biocides are. With your label that you have on for a biocide, it's not the claims that are made and the technical information and the instructions, the application instructions that are on that biocide label have to match almost virtually word for word with what's on the master label, or at least not word for word, but basically have to match 100% in substance. So the master label governs how the instructions to the user for using that biocide, and it really governs how you can talk about that or describe that biocide to other parties. This is not entirely a bad thing. It does place limitations on people who sell biocides, but in a way, that's probably a good thing, because one of the things that it really kind of draws, puts the brakes on, if you will, is this tendency for within the fuel additive industry to make wild and outrageous claims about things. Like I said, you go out there, look on the store shelves, you can find all sorts of products making all sorts of weird and wild claims because they want you to buy them. They want you to think that they are the best. But biocides are not allowed to do that. They're very controlled in what they can claim. So someone could not take a biocide chemistry like an isothiazolone and package it under a certain trade name and say, our biocide is the best under any condition, so you should buy it. They can't make that kind of claim. And the reason they can't make that kind of claim is the master label for isothiazolone, that chemistry, doesn't say this biocide is the best and beats all the others. And so the EPA, when you register a biocide, one of the things you have to do is you have to submit to the Office of Pesticides your labels that you are going to use, and they will approve your labels and say, yes, you can use that label to put on the package, because they want to make sure that how you're describing the biocide matches with what the registration information, the master registration information, if you will, actually confirms. So this is a good thing. It makes marketers and sellers of biocides stick more closely to what is actually provable by the evidence that's associated with that chemistry. It's good for the customer because as a customer, You don't have to deal with everyone making outrageous claims that nobody knows whether they are true or not. The descriptions of the biocide on the label and on the main marketing information, like product sheets, for example, all has to conform with the registration test data for that biocide chemistry. Now, so let's say that a biocide chemistry is registered and they have a master label. Now, there are people who will then do what they call a white label. They'll say, I want to sell that isothiazolone, but I don't want to sell it as isothiazolone. I want to sell it as this product name. Now, they can do that if they apply for one of the kinds of registrations, whether it's a primary registration, or what they call a Me Too, I think, or a secondary registration. And whatever registration they have dictates what exactly, how they can sell it. Whether they have to use the same name or whether they have to use a different name. So any biocide that comes labeled, any biocide product with a different trade name that wants to use the registered chemistry but call it a different trade name, they can do that if they get the proper registrations. What they cannot do is they cannot make any kinds of claims, like the kind to set themselves apart from the competition. They can't make any kind of claims that do not align with what's on the master label. If they do try to do that, the Office of Pesticides will reject their registration until they make the required changes that eliminate any conflict with the master label. All right, so if you look out on the biocide landscape, if you take the state of the landscape, so to speak, there are a lot more trade names of biocide products out there than there are actual chemistries. And that means that most or many of the legitimate biocide trade names of products out there are actually relabels or white labels of parent chemistries. And so what we want to do is we want to talk about what some of those chemistries are and what it takes in order to be able to do what we just talked about. So up to this point, both today and also in our previous episode, we have established a number of things. We've established that a product that just says it controls water, that does not mean that that product is a biocide. And if they only talk about controlling water, that probably means for sure that it is not a biocide. We've talked about the fact that it's not a legally registered and approved biocide if you can't find both registration numbers on the front or the back label. And I think we touched on this last time, but it's it bears repeating that looking for those registration numbers and not being able to find them, it very rarely is it a case where you just happen to miss them, that they were there and you just made a mistake and you couldn't see them. That's really not how this works, because the registration numbers, the two registration numbers, have to be easily findable because people are going to look for them. If you can't find them, then it is not a legally registered and approved biocide. That's the bottom line. And if that product is talking like it is, but you can't find those registration numbers, they're breaking the law, and you definitely want to stay away from it because it's highly, highly likely that it's not going to do what you actually need it to do. So now that we have established those facts, let's look at things that are actually biocides. So let's say that you manage fuel. Let's say that you're the operations manager for a hospital. Let's say that your Joint Commission inspection is coming up, and you know that one of the things that, as a hospital or a nursing home or whatever, you know that one of the things Joint Commission is going to do is they are going to look at the condition of the backup fuel that you are required by the regulations to have. That backup fuel has to be in good condition. It has to be in spec. And if you have a microbial problem in the tank, it's going to fail. And so let's say that you happen to find that you do have a microbial problem. So you need to solve this problem. You need to solve it for sure before your inspection comes up in X number of weeks. So you know you have a microbial problem. you know, because you've been a faithful listener to this podcast, that you need a biocide is what you need to solve that problem. And you may even progress to the point, again, because you listened to our previous episode, that there's a difference between things that are biocides and things that are not, but just want to fool you into thinking there. You know that there's that difference there. You're good with all that. You are ready to make a decision on the biocide chemistry to purchase. So what I said earlier, remember, there are a limited number of biocide chemistries that are registered with the Office of Pesticides. And then there are many trade names for those chemistries. And that means that all those trade names are basically just repackages of the same thing. That doesn't mean they're bad, but it doesn't mean that there's a substantive difference between a repackage A of an isothiazolone chemistry and repackage B of an isothiazolone chemistry. They're actually both pretty much the same. So what are the more popular chemistries and associated trade names that you are likely to find as you're trying to find something to solve this problem and pass your Joint Commission inspection? Well, we're going to talk about five. I'll say the five most popular, five most common ones that you're likely to find when you go on this search. And those five are, first of all, number one is what they call a diboronane, otherwise known as Biobor JF. We're going to talk about that because there are some interesting things about that we want to talk about. Number two is what I've mentioned a couple of times, isothiazolone. A popular trade name for this, again, not the only trade name, but a popular trade name that's well known within the industry, is a product called Kathon FP1.5. A third one we're going to talk about is called nitromorpholin, and Predator from Innospec is a version, is a white label of that chemistry. Fourth one is thiocyanate. Bell Performance's Biocide biocide is a package of thiocyanate chemistry. And then the fifth one is what they call MBO. That's an acronym. And that is marketed and sold under the trade name Clearkill. Those are not the only five chemistries that are out there in the world, but they are probably the five most popular, what we call broad spectrum chemistries. And we'll talk about what broad spectrum means. But they're not the only ones that have ever existed. There are others, but those may be a little harder to find. There's a chemistry that used to be more popular called a carbamate. I believe Quaker used to sell one called AquaTreat DNM. But carbamates tend to have been phased out. They've been banned in Europe, and it has to do with safety and environmental concerns. So carbamates are pretty much now a non-factor in the biocide landscape. There's also biocide chemistry called glutaraldehyde. Those are kind of hard to find. If you can find them, they are actually very, very good, but they're not as popular as some of these others. Now, when we talk about diboronane or isothiazolone or thiocyanate, we don't mean to imply that because we listed those five and we said that they were broad spectrum, we don't want to imply that means that they are all the same, because they're most definitely not all the same. There are relevant differences between these chemistries. They're not all equally effective under the same conditions. There are other factors that go along that, and so we're going to talk about some of those factors so that you will know more about these chemistries, and then you'll be able to make the right decision for what you need if you were that person who was looking for this. So, as I said earlier, one of the reasons why we're talking about them, and one of the reasons why those are maybe the most well-known chemistries out there, is because they are what we call broad spectrum. That means that they have shown effectiveness at killing a very wide swath of the most common kinds of microbes that are found in the places you're likely to use them in, like fuel storage tanks. Now, when we say that, when we say they're proven to kill the broadest variety of the most common kinds of microbes, we're not necessarily talking about species. We're talking about classes of microbes. Remember, the kinds of microbes that you typically will find in fuel and fuel storage tanks are different classes: bacteria, molds, yeasts, fungus, methanogens, things like that. You don't tend to find, let's say, viruses. You definitely don't find algae, even though it's common in the market or in the trade to call all of that algae. Um, but they're not algae. They're other kinds of microbes. Algae, remember, needs light to grow, and it's kind of hard to grow in a dark fuel storage tank. So they're not algae. They're these other classes of microbes. And these broad spectrum biocides are the ones that have been proven to be the most effective at killing the broad swath of these kinds of microbes. Now, let's say a few words about these different chemistries. Let's start with isothiazolone. Okay, so isothiazolone. Say that 5 times fast. Um, Isothiazolone is a very good broad spectrum biocide, and I don't just say that, as out of routine. It's a very good broad spectrum biocide. So it's good at killing a broad spectrum of microbes that are likely to be causing those microbe problems that you're trying to solve. Um, Another good thing about isothiazolone is it doesn't contribute any meaningful amount of sulfur, which we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's effective against a lot of different microbes. It's been proven in kill studies to be that way. One notable thing about isothiazolone is it used to be approved for use in aviation fuel. And that was true up until about, let's say, about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. And something happened a couple of years, which actually is really starting to affect the aviation industry. And that is that the original holder of the master registration for the isothiazolone chemistry, the original holder of the master registration is Dow. That tiny company that nobody's heard of, Dow Chemical. When they originally created and registered it, they registered it under the name Fuel Saver. And then they allowed all these other people like Kathon to white label it and to market it. So about 2 years ago, Dow decided that it did not want that biocide to be used in aviation fuel. And so they petitioned the FAA and the Office of Pesticides to allow them to make a change to the master label registration, and they removed the aviation arena from the list of approved uses. And so once they did that, that meant that you could not use it. It was no longer approved to be used in aviation fuel. That, again, remember, if you understand how biocide registrations work, you know that that's one way that defines how you can use these, is the uses and things and conditions and situations that are listed on the master label. So they took it off the master label, which means you can no longer use it in aviation. And that created a problem for aviation, because up until when they did that, there were actually only 2 biocides in the United States that were approved for use in aviation fuel. Isothiazolone was one, BioBor was the other one. So now you can't use isothiazolone in there, which means BioBor is the only one that can be used in the aviation. It can be used in aviation fuel. One last thing about isothiazolone. If you, it is one of the biocides that is actually used in consumer products. We have been talking about using biocides in diesel fuel storage tanks, things like that. But that's by no means the only place that biocides are used. In the first episode, we talked about how it's actually, stored fuel usage and fuel storage tanks is actually a really small sliver of the overall biocide pie, and that the upstream oil and gas with like drilling and fracking, they probably use the most of them. Um, but there are certain kinds of consumer products that actually have biocides in them. One of them are liquid soaps, the kind that you buy in the pump bottles, liquid soaps, and shampoos. And that's kind of counterintuitive because you don't really think of, the shampoo that you use um, growing mold in it. But if you leave it long enough, it actually will. And so what they found is that they actually have to add biocide, and isothiazolone is the most popular one for this. They actually have to add biocide in order to extend the shelf life of the shampoo that you're going to use. So next time you're in the shower, if you flip your bottle over and you look on the back, way down towards the bottom, you should see something that says like a really long word, and it says something like methyl isothiazolone, something like that. And if you see that, this is what it's talking about. That's the biocide that makes sure that your shampoo doesn't go moldy. So isothiazolone, very good broad spectrum biocide, doesn't contribute any sulfur. Biobor. Biobor is what they call a diboronane chemistry. And it is probably the most well-known biocide of all of these. If you ask the average professional to name a biocide, Biobor is by far going to be the first one that they think of. And there's reason for that. Biobor came out in the 60s, and it was actually the first biocide that was approved for use in jet fuel. The official name of Biobor is Biobor JF. JF is jet fuel. Now, it stands to reason that it would be good for use in jet fuel. And what we mean by that is what we mean by that aligns with one of the big problems that Biobor has that is not that well known, except to people within the industry who know these kind of chemistries. And that is that Biobor has a problem with interacting with water. Now, let's wrap up the point about jet fuel. One of the defining characteristics of jet fuel is that it's supposed to have as close to zero of water in it as possible, because you do not want water in your jet fuel or in your aviation fuel when you're up at 30,000 feet, because what's going to happen to that water? It's going to freeze. And then it's going to plug something or go somewhere it's not supposed to, and you got a world of problems. So jet fuel is supposed to be as dry as possible, which makes it the perfect place to use a biocide like Biobor. The manufacturer, Hammond's, says that does not matter. And this is where, when we talk about Biobor and we talk about the effectiveness, we have to be careful about specific claims that we make, because technical information, like how well a biocide kills certain types of microbes, it's very contextual. When you talk about whether Biobor is a good biocide or a bad biocide, and by that we mean is it an effective biocide or not? We have to be careful in what we say, because everything's contextual. So what I will say is that I have seen multiple kill studies that compare Biobor with other kinds of biocide chemistries that show that on the whole, the Biobor formulation is not nearly as effective, not nearly as good at killing microbes as some of these others. And so, in my opinion, Biobor is actually the worst of the chemistries, in my opinion. Hammond's would disagree and say it's the best, because we would expect them to say that. But having talked with people in the industry, and having looked at kill studies and comparisons under a number of different situations, the weight of the evidence that I have seen indicates to me that Biobor is actually not as good, not as effective as a number of these other chemistries. But it is the most well known, and so there you go. All right, so we've talked about isothiazolone, we've talked about BioBor. So remember, you're that hospital administrator, and you're like, well, okay, isothiazolone, BioBor. What about some of the others? A third one that you might come across is the thiocyanate chemistry, like Biocide. Thiocyanate's a very, very good broad spectrum biocide. It's very good at killing lots of different kinds of microbes that you're likely to find in your tank. Um, the thio in the name implies sulfur. So there is a sulfur molecule or sulfur atom in the thiocyanate active molecule. That means it adds a moderate amount of sulfur when you treat the fuel. Now, what do we mean by moderate amount? Um, Moderate amount means if you use it under normal kill, what they call shock dose or kill dose, which is usually about 1 to 5,000 volumetric, it's going to add maybe around 2.5 ppm of sulfur. Now, we'll talk about why that matters here in a minute, because that does matter, but only under certain conditions. So, uh, Belicide thiocyanate chemistry, very good at killing the kinds of microbes you need to kill. It's got a very good length of kill. What that means is how long does it maintain those high kill rates? Maintaining those for as long a time period as possible is better than not maintaining those. Now, this is, as with many things, this is a little bit contextual. So let's talk about that. And let's talk about that by framing it in terms of a question. Someone who doesn't know that much might ask a very fair question. They might say, if I use a biocide, let's say I use Belicide to kill, to knock out the microbes in my tank, how long is it going to last for? Now, we say that this is contextual because it depends on a number of things. It depends on how bad your microbial problem was to begin with. Because remember, if you think about it, not all storage tanks are the same, and it would not be reasonable to expect that if one storage tank has 1 billion microbes per milliliter and another storage tank has 100,000 microbes per milliliter, and you had the same amount of biocide, you would not expect that you would expect the first one to get used up faster because there's more microbes for it to kill, right? So answering the question, how long is it going to work for, is contextual, depending on that is a contextual answer that depends on a number of things, like how bad your microbial problem is. What we tend to say when we try to generalize this so that people can understand it is that kill studies have shown that under many common conditions, a biocide like thiocyanate can maintain a full kill for up to 4 weeks. Now, this is important to understand. 4 weeks is a good length of time for a complete kill. What is one of the things that people misunderstand about this is they think that biocides to a certain extent are you treat it once and you never have to treat it again, which does not make sense, but that is what people think. I remember talking to a person in the industry who had storage tanks, and they had gotten a high microbe test result back, and they were surprised, and they said, we shouldn't have a high microbe test because we just treated with biocide a year ago. And we had to point out that a year is plenty of time for, depending on the conditions, of course, because again, everything's contextual, but under most common conditions, a year is plenty of time for a microbial contamination problem to come back. So, all of the things being equal, you want a biocide to last, to maintain its kill for as long as possible, and the thiocyanate chemistry is really good at doing that. Now, let's talk about the sulfur issue. Let's go back to that. Now, again, we said thio in thiocyanate means sulfur, and so if you treat with thiocyanate under normal treat rates, you're going to add 2.5, maybe 3 ppm parts per million of sulfur to that fuel. Now, if it's regular ultra low sulfur diesel fuel, that typically gets to you at between 4 and 6 parts per million. So if you add another, 3 to that, you still don't have any worries about exceeding the 15 parts per million sulfur regulations. Now, what BioBor has tried to do is they have made some noise in the industry through some pieces where they have tried to ding the thiocyanate chemistry for adding any amount of sulfur to that. And what they do is they talk about the fact that thiocyanate has, tens of thousands of ppm of sulfur in it, and you don't want to add that to your ultra low sulfur diesel and run afoul of regulations, do you? No, of course not. So you shouldn't use it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what you have to remember with those claims that they're making are two things. First thing is that, yeah, the 100% pure chemical has, tens of thousands of ppm of sulfur, but you're not, you're adding that at a 1 to 5,000 treat rate, or whatever the treat rate is you need to add it. And so that means you're not adding tens of thousands of ppm of sulfur, you're adding 2.5 or 3 or 3.5. And so that particular concern is dramatically overstated by Hammonds when they're writing that. The thing that you do want to consider with the sulfur issue is whether the fuel is high turn or low turn. If you don't know what that means in the industry, high turn means it gets used up quickly. So a good example of a high turn fuel situation would be a gas station, right? They get multiple fuel drops a week because they sell the fuel, and so it keeps getting turned over and turned over. That doesn't mean they can't develop microbial problems. They very much can. But in terms of adding enough sulfur to their ultra low sulfur diesel tank that they're afraid that they're going to exceed the 15, it's going to get sold. It's not going to be in a situation where they're going to keep it in that tank long enough to have to treat it more than once. They might treat it in order to solve that micro problem, to kill all those microbes, but then it's being sold, it's out the door, and it's being replaced by new fuel that's 4 ppm or 5 ppm. So high turn fuel doesn't have to worry about sulfur being added by a biocide like thiocyanate. What does have to worry about, the people that do have to, is the people that have low turn fuel. Low turn means it's fuel that sits in the tank and does not get used up very quickly. And you might have a situation where fuel stays in there for more than a year or 2 years. And let's say that they treat yearly with biocide, and they have ULSD, and they started out at 6. And let's say they treat, excuse me, and they had 3 more. So now they're at 9. So they're good. But let's say that they don't use that fuel. They only use a little bit of it, and so they add a little bit on top of it, to fill up the tank. So now they're at 8.5 ppm. And they get another micro problem a year and a half later. So they treat again, and they've added another 3. And let's say they repeat that cycle a couple times because they're really not using that fuel. They have to have it, but they're not using it very fast. Eventually, there is a concern that those people may exceed the 15 ppm. It's an understandable concern. So if your fuel is low turn like that, sulfur, adding additional sulfur through a biocide may be something that you want to keep an eye on. And so which one would you use? Well, isothiazolene's a very good choice, but it's not the only choice. BioBor doesn't add sulfur, but I've already said that it's my opinion that BioBor is probably the least effective based on the things and discussions that I've had within the industry. There's another biocide out there that does not add any sulfur at all and is actually really, really effective, and that is the 5th chemistry that we talked about, that we mentioned in the beginning, MBO, also sold as Clearkill. MBO is an acronym. It stands for a really long chemical molecule name. But it is a biocide chemistry that has been in use in Europe for decades. It's got OEM approvals by people like Mercedes-Benz. It's used by militaries like, the Swiss National Guard. It's used by a lot of people in Europe because it is extremely effective, doesn't add any sulfur. And one of the other advantages that it has, and this is something that's worth considering, is that it provides an additional functionality that none of these other chemistries offer. And that is that the MBO molecules, in addition to being really, really good at killing microbes without adding any sulfur, in addition to that, it also adds protection against corrosion in that tank. People in the industry may remember a few years ago, the EPA commissioned a study where they were looking at microbial corrosion in storage tanks. They're still doing research on that, but their initial report basically said, yeah, corrosion's a problem, and we think microbes are to blame. And one of the things that they did, the recommendations that they did, that they made, the EPA made, was you want to use biocides to kill the microbes, and you also want to use an anti-corrosion treatment in your tank. Well, the MBO biocide does both of those things, and that is a big advantage. So if you were to use MBO, you would be getting arguably the most effective biocide out there. Hammonds would dispute whether it's more effective than BioBor. I would put MBO up against BioBor any day of the week in terms of effectiveness. You got a really effective biocide that also provides dual functionality as for corrosion protection inside your tank. And so given its additional functionality and given its base effectiveness, and then given the fact that since it doesn't add any sulfur, you don't have to worry about violating sulfur limits. If you're that person that's trying to pick a biocide for this hospital, you probably would look at MBO and you would probably say, well, let's look at using that. So whichever one of these you choose, up to this point, I hope that we've been able to call out some differences that are easy to understand and will give you a little bit more perspective on which of these chemistries are going to be the best ones for you to use. We hope that whatever you have to choose, that you now know more about how to make the best decision for your situation. Because of the environment that we live in, because of the way that the fuel has changed, because of the economic pressures that we're all under, preventing damage from microbes, solving microbial problems is more important than ever. And so it is more important than ever to make a good decision, to make the right decision, to not get fooled into buying into something that's not actually a biocide, and to pick a legitimate biocide that's actually going to work the best to give you what you needed to do. So hopefully, over this and the previous episode, you're now at a point where you are better able to tell what are legitimate biocide solutions that will help you versus the illegitimate ones that will actually do more harm than good. Not the least with being, take your money and not solve your problems. So hopefully you feel that you're in a better position to make a good decision than you might have been, an hour or two ago. So that wraps up things for today's episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. I want to thank you again for spending part of your day or night with us talking about this very important issue. Check the show notes at our website for links to some of the things that we talked about. Those are located at our website, www.bellperformance.com. Be sure, if you have not already, we would really encourage you to subscribe to this podcast. You can do it wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's iTunes, Stitcher, Amazon Podcasts, any of those. Be sure to subscribe, tell your friends, have them subscribe. And last but not least, If you liked what you heard, if you found this useful, we would love if you left us a review of the podcast at your preferred site, because reviews are a really important way to help people find us and help us get the word out. So that's all for now. Bye-bye, everybody, and we'll catch you next time at the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.